in Australia, we're down here at the bottom of the world where a lot of us feel geographically dislocated from those issues in the Northern Hemisphere because we've all been so reliant on and accustomed to this stable rules-based world order. And I think that's given way to a high degree of complacency about our own food security and our own capacity to be able to manufacture and process and distribute food in a disrupted environment where we don't have access to the critical imported inputs that we need to be as productive as we are.
Welcome back to the Vegalogue podcast, a dialogue about the Australian vegetable industry from AUSVEG. I'm Alex Lashchuk. In 2022, AUSVEG made a submission to the House Standing Committee on Agriculture on food security in Australia. The issues raised over 2 years ago, such as workforce shortages, financial viability, declining consumption, climate change, biosecurity threats, supply chain resilience, are as relevant today as they were then. However, this prolonged period of cost of production squeeze is threatening the viability of growers, and the security of our fresh vegetable supply is at serious risk. Our guest today is Andrew Henderson, Senior Fellow of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and co-author of the National Food Security Preparedness Green Paper. Andrew is a leading voice on the intersection of agriculture and national security, and in this episode, he unpacks how food security is not just a farming issue, but a national priority. Join us as we explore what's at stake if Australia doesn't act now to strengthen its food system and what practical steps growers, policymakers and peak bodies can take to prepare for an increasingly uncertain world. Well, good morning, Andrew, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Alex. Much appreciated.
Andrew, to start us off, could you briefly explain how you see the intersection between food security and national security, particularly in the context of Australia's vegetable industry?
Look, effectively, how I perceive food security's intersection with national security is that food is a fundamental requirement of every single person. It's the one thing that we have absolutely in common with everybody all around the world. And I think that ensuring that people have access to safe, reliable, and affordable food at all times that meets their needs is a foundation of a cohesive society that is peaceful. And I think at the end of the day, that's that feeds all the way up in a national security sense because hungry people are discontent, and discontent breeds instability, and instability becomes a threat to a nation state's national security. And we've seen that over the course of history, and we'll continue to see examples of that for years to come. And so, food security, I think, is something that is so basic to the security and stability of a nation and a region, particularly when we think about our region, the Indo-Pacific. And the food security of our neighbours. And of course, fresh produce, access to vegetables is a fundamental part of that. And ensuring that we have basic productive capacity in that regard is really important. So I guess that's my take on the linkage between food security and national security. We've also linked, biosecurity to food security, and that's something that's very relevant to your listeners and to all of us, and particularly the production side of the agriculture sector. Without an effective and functioning biosecurity system, then we can't guarantee food security. And if we can't guarantee food security, I don't think that it's reasonable to guarantee national security.
The 2024 AUSVEG Vegetable Industry Sentiment Report highlights a serious crisis in farm profitability, with a third of vegetable growers considering leaving the industry within the next 12 months. How critical is it to Australia's national food security that we retain a viable fresh produce sector, and what immediate actions are needed to prevent further erosion of domestic production?
Well, I'd say now more than ever, it is absolutely critical to Australia's food security that we retain that viable fresh produce sector because, effectively our food system's evolved off the back of globalized just-in-time supply chains, and that's what's made us vulnerable. Ironically, it's what's made products affordable. It's been the most efficient means through which we can get food affordably onto the supermarket shelf. But the downside to that is that our supply chains become long. and they become vulnerable to shocks. And those long, vulnerable supply chains assume that the world will always be governed by a stable, rules-based world order. And that's, of course, particularly uncertain right now, and we know that that's no longer the case. Everything that's going on with regard to Trump, is the latest example of the deterioration of that situation. So, a nation's capacity to be able to have a domestic productive capacity mitigates the downside impact of reliance on those long just-in-time supply chains. So, as the world becomes more and more volatile, then so too does the importance of the role of domestic capability, sovereign capability of food production becomes more and more important, not just to us domestically, but also to our near neighbours. And that's where our security, I believe, truly lies. So it cannot be understated how important that is. And, I cited that statistic with regard to farm profitability in the National Food Security Preparedness Green Paper, which we recently released, because that's something that decision makers, at a state and territory and a Commonwealth level need to be really cognizant of, because the more we lose that productive capability, the harder it is to get it back. It can't just be switched on overnight once people start to exit the industry. So it's a serious issue that needs to be taken more seriously in the broader context of maintaining our food security as part of national security. In terms of immediate actions, we get into, I guess, what we've recommended in terms of the policy options that we put forward in the Green Paper, and that is that, we start to think about our food system, our agriculture sector, so from a production perspective, and our food system as a food security ecosystem. So we're not looking at these things in isolation anymore. So that's step number one. That doesn't cost any money to do that, and a new government can do that on day one. The other thing that a new government can do is establish the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry as the lead agency responsible for food security and food security preparedness in the administrative arrangements orders of a new government. So, by the time this podcast goes to air, we'll know who the new government is, and they will have probably by that stage, drawn up what their cabinet looks like and established administrative arrangements orders. And what we hope to see in that is an elevation of food and agriculture in the cabinet at that level, because that can then start to, raise these issues above, I guess, all of the competing priorities of government and the broader economy that have detracted from our capacity to be able to argue the point on the things that impact farm viability, profitability at an individual business level. There's a range of other policy options that we put forward in the Green Paper that aren't going to solve a producer's profitability problems overnight, but certainly will go a long ways to establishing a framework that prioritizes food production above other regulatory priorities that do impact farm gate profitability. And, one of the things that I'd really like to see, and this is something that a new government can absolutely do, is with the elevation of food and agriculture at a government level by establishing agriculture as the lead agency for the food system and food security preparedness, is put in place a simple test. Every new policy proposal that comes through cabinet, both at a state and, we're talking at a Commonwealth government level, but state governments can absolutely jump on this as well, can establish a test that every new policy proposal, or an NPP as they're called, can go forward with a test associated as to whether or not it's good or bad for food production. A simple test. So right now, NPPs that go forward and through the cabinet process that are brought up by agencies have to meet certain criteria. Are they good or bad for the environment in terms of climate impacts? There's gender issues, gender equality, as well as First Nations impacts and all of that sort of stuff. So why shouldn't there be, as a question, why shouldn't there be a test as to whether a piece of regulation that comes forward is good or bad for food production? And if it doesn't pass that test, if it has a net negative impact on a farmer's viability, for example, if it's a piece of IR legislation or environment legislation, then it shouldn't go forward. So that's the type of practical thing that a new government can do immediately, that elevates at a very practical level food and agricultural production above other, as a priority that it should be in maintaining this nation's food security.
Australia is facing increasingly variable and extreme weather patterns, and we know from recent weather events the disruptions that occur to food supply when an extreme weather event occurs. From a food security perspective, is enough being done to help farmers and growers prepare for adverse weather events?
That's a big question. The answer is always going to be no, but that is not in spite of the best efforts of many people across many different agencies to try and mitigate the impacts of climate volatility and increasing climate volatility on food production and people right across communities that are particularly in vulnerable areas and what have you. As the climate, everybody knows that the environment's a beast that we don't have any control over. And so, we will never be able to do enough, I don't think, to mitigate these impacts. I think there's been a lot done, particularly since the Black Summer bushfires, with regards to changes to the Australian government's crisis management frameworks, which now much better coordinate activities between the Commonwealth and the states and territories around emergency management frameworks and emergency response and incident response capabilities. However, there's a piece of that continuum, Australian government's crisis management continuum, that is preparedness. And that's the bit that our green paper really focuses on, thinking about environment in a broader context around food security and its intersection with national security. But preparedness, investment in preparedness, is completely underdone. We're not very good at it in this country, and we need to think about it with much greater clarity and much higher priority. So producers inherently prepare for events, and it's been said actually that farmers are generally, and I think I agree with this, good at handling one crisis. They can handle two crises, but when it comes to the third crisis, that's when things start to get hairy. And my colleague and co-author on the report, Dr. John Coyne, uses this term that increasingly common and concurrent and cascading crises is something that it's a new reality that we have to come to terms with and learn how to face. And so that's going to be a significant priority going forward, because natural disasters are going to become more and more common, and they're going to happen in conjunction with other things that will create competitive tension in response capabilities and what have you. So it's something that needs to be very high up on the agenda of advocacy bodies like yourselves, and also in the minds of producers themselves, in terms of how prepared they are to be able to handle these types of things going forward.
The Australian Food Story Feeding the Nation and Beyond report from November 2023 suggests that diversifying and decentralizing supply chains would enhance food system resilience. What practical steps can the vegetable industry take to achieve this, and what role should local and regional supply chains play?
Well, there's something that's easier said than done. I've looked at this long and hard, and there's a certain irony about the fact that we feel like we're coming. People talk about a circular economy. We are really coming full circle back to where we might have been decades and decades ago with regard to localized food systems. And I think there's a really strong argument to make around that, because that certainly bolsters sovereign capability and what have you. But because of the aggregated nature of our production system, how it's evolved off the back of those, efficient supply chains, that naturally mean that, anything that's not viable goes to the wayside. But then 5 decades ago, infrastructure was put in place for a reason, in order to be able to bolster, capability. But as technology's evolved and what have you, that's meant that we can there's an element of consolidation that's taken place. But what that's meant is that we face a situation where a government report comes out with a recommendation that says diversifying and decentralized supply chains would be a positive thing, would help resilience, right? The reason that doesn't happen is because it costs money. And so there's a point to make here around the focus that was attributed to supply chain resilience in the context of COVID. And all of your listeners would remember, they might not remember, maybe a lot of us have put it out of our brains, but the COVID task force, the establishment of the Office of Supply Chain Resilience, which is still in operation, and various other mechanisms that sought to, I guess, mitigate the impacts of supply chain disruption in a COVID context. Very important to remember that the future that we face is not like COVID. It's vastly different to that. And so, the Productivity Commission, and we go into this in the report, states that businesses, private enterprise, is primarily responsible for the resilience of its own supply chains, except that there's a role to play for government, a much greater role to play for government in a national security context. We are absolutely living in a national security threat environment. So in terms of practical steps, because this stuff's really easy to talk about. It's hard to know, like if you're listening to me saying this on a tractor right now, what can you do on your farm to try and mitigate the impact of this? And there's a real sense of helplessness and hopelessness that can come with that. What we've sought to do is not just highlight the problem through the green paper. We've sought to offer practical and feasible things that people can do at an individual business level, all the way up to the highest levels of government, to take action in this regard and build their own resilience. So that comes in the form of a threat and risk assessment methodology that we've put in the green paper, along with case studies that we've run that methodology over, which include glyphosate for crop as a crop protection product, phosphate for fertilizer, and then of course digital connectivity, which is something that we don't often think about in terms of our reliance on these days. But modern production systems are inherently reliant on digital connectivity. Think of the Inmarsat outage a couple of years ago that shut down half the East Coast winter crop planting for 48 hours. So equipping an individual producer with a different way, a more nuanced way of thinking about risks and threats, which is different to just risk management in a business as usual environment, can help individuals to understand what their priorities are and prioritize them. Importantly, prioritize them, because this whole deal, it's why nothing has ever happened effectively in this regard before, because it's a massive elephant that no one knows where to start eating it, right? So we're trying to offer a pathway to start eating the elephant one bite at a time. So the most granular thing we can do is offer this methodology to a producer to create a more nuanced way of understanding what their vulnerabilities are via this threat and risk assessment process. Once they've identified their vulnerabilities, for example, liquid fuels, they would prioritize them and come up with the top 5. And what needs to happen post-election, and we're arguing as part of a food security strategy implementation process, is then an aggregated process that's coordinated centrally, in this case through what is known as the Food and Grocery Sector Group, which is part of the critical infrastructure framework legislated out of Home Affairs, is to then coordinate the outcomes of the assessment processes all the way up the line to an industry level. And that's where organisations like AUSVEG could play a really valuable role in aggregating the collective prioritised vulnerabilities of a sector, which then can be taken forward to say, once we as the horticulture sector have identified there could be 200 vulnerabilities, right? Some of which we know about, like liquid fuels, fertilizers, crop protection products, those sorts of things, and others that are more obscure that we don't know about, like packaging components, pallets, containers, things of that nature that we got caught with in COVID. Once you've identified and prioritize those vulnerabilities, then you can work out what to do about them in a coordinated and methodical way, and then who is responsible for doing something about them, and with what resources. So this can get big really quickly, but it starts that granular. And so if the industry can then understand what its prioritized vulnerabilities are, then you just pick them off one by one by one. Now, that takes time. There are finite resources between the private sector and government, but you have to start somewhere, is our argument. So mitigate those vulnerabilities one by one by one. And that's where the AUSVEGs of the world, I think, can play a really important role in terms of aggregating that information up the line, and then working collaboratively with government to understand the who bit. Who does something about those vulnerabilities? What is it? What is the preparedness activity? Who should be responsible for doing something about it? And then how and with what resources. And so that's where we start to go into making sure that there's accountability within government, given that we're talking about these things through a national security lens now. And that's where we get to elevating the role of food and agriculture at a Commonwealth level to lead agency status, as I mentioned before, to get away from this competitive tension that exists across the bureaucracy that establishes the food system and food security preparedness as a high priority in a national security context of government. And so that accountability exists there, and then we can make sure that things actually get done, and vulnerabilities actually get mitigated, and do so much sooner than what they otherwise would be able to be done in a business as usual type environment.
During the recent federal election campaign, both major parties made commitments to develop a national food security strategy. How important is it that food security remains a bipartisan, long-term commitment, and what steps are needed to ensure that these strategies lead to real on-the-ground action for vegetable growers rather than just further rounds of consultation?
Well, the short answer is that it is absolutely critical that this issue enjoys bipartisan support. And I note that even the Greens came out and supported, national food security strategy and welcomed the National Food Security Preparedness Green Paper. It was criticised because it doesn't have a heavy enough climate focus. That's fine. But the reality is, it demonstrates the fact that food security really affects everybody. So, making sure that it remains that it maintains bipartisan support is absolutely critical, and making sure that it doesn't just become another round of consultations that takes years to harvest information before anything is actually done is absolutely vital. And I'll tell you why. Your listeners may or may not be familiar with the Defence Strategic Review that was released by government in 2023, and it was followed by the National Defence Strategy in 2024. Now, both of those documents highlighted that, and I didn't know this necessarily before I started researching these documents a few years ago, but Defence has always worked on the basis that in the Indo-Pacific, there's this assumed 10-year warning time for conflict. And that means, as the nation state starts to, reveal itself as a potential threat or what have you, we'd have 10 years or so time to prepare ourselves for that. Now, both of those documents going back to 2023 state that we no longer have 10 years. There is no longer the 10-year warning time that we've assumed in the past we would have. And that means that kinetic conflict could take place in the Indo-Pacific much sooner than that. Bear in mind that those statements were made by the government themselves some years ago now. So when it comes to mitigating our own vulnerabilities in the food system, and this has been the primary driver behind why I've grabbed hold of this so tightly, because I don't think that we can prepare ourselves in a defense context without also preparing the food system to do what it needs to do in the same disrupted future that the defense forces are preparing for. That's a really important point. So we literally don't have time to take a business as usual approach to developing up what a strategy needs to look like. And that's been the primary motivation of the Green Paper, is to offer these policy options. The process that I articulated before with regard to the threat and risk methodology coordinated through the Food and Grocery Sector Group, accountable to the Department of Agriculture, that's elevated in status to be primarily responsible, reporting to the National Security Committee of Cabinet, to enact these things yesterday, effectively, so that we can begin the process of understanding what those vulnerabilities are, prioritizing them, coming up with preparedness activities to mitigate those vulnerabilities, and getting to work as quickly as we possibly can, because there just isn't the time. The time doesn't exist, and that's not me saying that. That's our national security agencies and the Defence Force saying that. So this process needs to move with the same level of priority. In terms of concrete steps, the purpose of including case studies in the Green Paper was to demonstrate how running that threat and risk assessment methodology over a critical input could yield preparedness activities that can be undertaken to minimize the impact of a disruption to the availability of that critical input. And that's why the paper is focused very deliberately on the preparedness element of the crisis management continuum for that reason. So let's take glyphosate as an example. Glyphosate is something that we have zero manufacturing capability of glyphosate technical in this country. All of it comes from primarily China and the Australian side of the supply chain. There's obviously a North American and South American supply chain as well, but we don't have as much access to it for reasons of economics and what have you. Glyphosate is synthesized in Australia using glyphosate technical imported from overseas. So while we import formulated glyphosate, we also formulate glyphosate in Australia, and there are several companies that still do that. But the whole deal inherently relies on an imported element of the product somewhere along the supply chain. Now, without glyphosate, and I'm sure that's something that's heavily used in the horticulture sector, as it is in the broadacre cropping sector, It's been said to me that that would set our industries back 40 years in terms of productive capability. So in terms of concrete things that can be done now, looking at critical inputs, glyphosate's just one. Liquid fuels is another. The government announced and I'm using this as an example. The government announced, you will have heard just prior to the election, if elected, that they'd implement a strategic reserve of critical minerals. Now that's done for very deliberate reasons. The private sector and free marketeers and economic dryers come out and can those sorts of things because it's the government intervening in the market that'll increase costs. But they've done that very deliberately because Australia needs to maintain strategic reserves of certain things so that we can have access to them in a disrupted environment. Now, I'd say the same logic should apply to critical inputs that the agriculture and sector and food system rely upon. And so that's why we've offered this methodology to arrive at that conclusion in an objective way. So that instead of, the farm lobby fronting up to government saying, we need a strategic stockpile of glyphosate because we know that that's something that we need, we can actually go through this process to arrive at that conclusion. And maybe it's a strategic stockpile of glyphosate. Technical. Maybe it's different regulatory settings that could be adjusted to assist the domestic manufacturing of glyphosate. Maybe it's additional research into alternatives to try and fast track commercialization of commercially viable alternatives to glyphosate. So using that as an example, they're the types of things that we need to be doing right now, but we need a process to be able to arrive at those conclusions. And that's what the threat and risk methodology is designed to do. It's designed to, prompt this discussion and saying, okay, we need to sit down as a sector and have a very deliberate process of identifying what those high priority vulnerabilities are. And then we need to start thinking about what we can do to mitigate them. Now, that's as true for an industry-wide conversation as it is for an individual producer level conversation. And me and my own business, I think every day about how I can continue to be viable in a disrupted environment where I don't have access to diesel. In my situation with regard to cattle trading, it's it's around animal medicines and things of that nature that I'd need to be able to make sure that I can continue to turn cattle over, move them in and out, and all of that type of stuff. So my inputs are quite low given what my business is around, but other businesses have much heavier reliance on critical inputs. So there are some concrete examples which I hope make sense.
The 2016 Consumer and Market Program for the Vegetable Industry report by Hort Innovation showed that Australian consumers thought 36% of fresh vegetables was imported, when in fact 98% of fresh vegetables consumed here in Australia are grown in Australia. If Australia fails to act now to better protect its food system, particularly the fresh produce sector, what are the real-world consequences you foresee for growers, consumers, and national resilience? And do you think consumers realise or care?
I'll start at the consumer-facing end first. The real-world consequence is food not on the grocery shelf. That's the real-world consequence. Now, we keep getting reminded of the fragility of our supply chains and the fragility of the food system, largely since COVID, where we experienced supply chain disruptions, all the way through to continuing disruptions in different geographies around Australia, like in Darwin, where the Stuart Highway gets cut off. Cyclone Alfred resulted in empty supermarket shelves, for a time when there's a run on the supermarkets and what have you. The upshot is a lack of availability of fresh, nutritious, and ultimately affordable produce. Now, Indigenous communities in remote and rural regional Australia understand that acutely already because of the costs associated with having to bring in fresh produce are hideous. And so that means that they simply don't have access to the type of food that they have a right to have access to. So there's impacts being felt right now. The impact of failing to act to secure the foundations of our food system is hungry people. And as I said at the top of the podcast, hungry people are discontent, and discontent breeds instability, and that instability becomes a national security issue. And that's why, myself and others are incredibly passionate about this. So there isn't time to waste. And I'd say I've been really excited by the level of engagement from AUSVEG and other peak bodies and national bodies and producers around the country of engagement with regard to this food security preparedness green paper process, because if we're gearing up for some kind of conflict or even just disruption for whatever the reason, in a really, really disrupted global environment, in a defense context, to the extent that we're prepared to spend $368 billion on nuclear-powered submarines, that we may or may not see that the National Defense Strategy that was released in 2024 that I mentioned earlier came with a $50 billion investment envelope over 10 years. Both sides of government have increased defence spending and aim to continue to increase defence spending to 2030. And this is not a criticism of the Albanese government that committed to a food security strategy, but rather it's an illustration of where we've got our priorities wrong. When the food security strategy, National Food Security Strategy, was announced with a $3.5 million cost attributed to it to fund the process. So we have our priorities fundamentally backwards. If we can't eat, we can't fight. If we can't eat, we can't withstand coercion. And so, failing to act now has really, really significant consequences. And it's not something that I say to scare people. It's something that I say to build awareness, because part of my mission has been about building awareness of the fragility of our food system, the importance of food security up through defence and national security, to bust this assumption that because we export 70% of what we produce, that we're food secure. But equally, it has to go back down the line to the agriculture sector and food system stakeholders, all the way down to an individual farmer level, so that they're alive to these threats and risks, and that there's a conversation happening on one side of Canberra about preparing for a particular type of future, and making sure that we're also preparing ourselves for that type of future, and that government et al. Is the private sector is aware and taking steps in conjunction with government. So it's not asking government to do it all, but it's asking government to empower the private sector, invest where necessary and in a strategic way, to be able to support our ability to be able to continue to put 98% of fresh vegetables consumed in this country on the supermarket shelf, and in an affordable way, so that people continue to have access to safe and affordable and nutritious food. And there's a range of different things that go into that. Addressing food waste, that's a huge thing that is completely underinvested in this country. And the fact that, Food Bank will tell you that 30% of households in 2024 are already experiencing domestic food insecurity. And that's a cost of living thing. So, yeah, the real world consequences are significant. And our resilience, just to that point on national resilience, really boils down to our capacity as a society to be able to function relatively normally and peacefully, and with a degree of stability and cohesion in a disrupted environment. That's what resilience to me means. And if we're unable to do that, then those that seek to do us harm will be able to do so far more easily than otherwise might be the case. So acting now is absolutely critical. The only thing I'd say is, the only additional thing I'd say is an encouragement to your listeners to empower the likes of AUSVEG and other representative bodies, and even RDCs, to become much more alive and aligned with the issues and the threats that are currently out there. Watching the deterioration of our geopolitical environment on the news is one thing, but understanding that it absolutely has real world consequences for us as growers, citizens and consumers is really important. So I'd say we're moving into a point in time now of our history in this country where we have no room for complacency, and that the role of the AUSVEGs of the world is becoming critically important in terms of making sure that we're working as collaboratively as possible with government to, like I said, begin the process of mitigating the vulnerabilities to the foundations of our food system, because making sure that we have that fundamental level of resilience and ability to be able to function, not only as a food system, but as communities and as a society in this disrupted environment, and in the context of potential threats that we face going forward into the future is really, really important.
Thank you, Andrew, for your insights into Australian food security.
Thank you for having me, and more than happy to come back and chat anytime. This is the beginning of the process. There's a lot more to unfold from here.
You've been listening to the Vegalogue podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and give the podcast a rating and review to help others find us. Vegalogue is produced by AUSVEG, the peak industry body for Australian vegetable, potato and onion growers. You can find more news and information from AUSVEG at ausveg.com.au, on our social media channels, or in the Australian Grower magazine. Thank you for listening.